His daughter had a headache that wouldn't go away. Just a dull ache behind her eyes at first, the kind you ignore for a day or two, hoping it's nothing. But 2 weeks in, the pain was constant. She'd wake with it. She'd sleep with it. By the 3rd week of January, 1889, she moved through the cabin like something exhausted was pulling at her from inside. His wife mentioned the dizziness, too. Nothing dramatic. Just, I felt strange this morning, and the room tilted when I stood up. And then she'd shake her head like clearing water from her ears and go about her work. His son was fine. Ivar himself was fine. He left the cabin before dawn to tend the livestock, wasn't inside during the worst of the day. But his daughter and wife, they stayed in the warmth. They slept on the warm floor. They breathed the warm air, the floor that everyone in the settlement had marveled at, the floor that was proving beyond doubt that his buried channel system actually worked, the floor that was slowly poisoning them with invisible, odorless carbon monoxide. And nobody knew to look for it because the system seemed so obviously successful. This is a story about a man who almost killed his family with the best idea anyone on that prairie ever had. Let me tell you something about knowledge, the kind that doesn't come from books or certificates or universities, the kind that lives in families for generations and gets passed down like recipes or superstitions or the sound of a language nobody else speaks. My grandmother, Emma, had that kind of knowledge. She grew up in a house that flooded regularly, so she learned about water management and drainage, and how to save what mattered most. She lived through a cholera outbreak, so she learned about sanitation before the county doctors caught up to what she already knew. She was a woman on the frontier, alone after her husband died. So she learned everything that men were supposed to know, and she was bitter about having to prove she'd learned it correctly. She died in the same house she built, and one of the last things she told me was this: good ideas can kill you if you don't understand how they work all the way through. She wasn't being poetic. She was giving me a rule. Emma had sealed a root cellar once without understanding that bad air accumulates in sealed spaces. Her family got sick. They had headaches, nausea, a thick confusion that made even simple tasks feel impossible. She spent 2 days wondering if they'd all caught something terminal before she finally realized the problem was the air itself. She tore that cellar apart, rebuilt it completely, installed a vent she didn't need to install just to make sure the air could move. The sickness stopped. The knowledge saved her family, but only because she'd been willing to destroy what she'd built and start over. That lesson lived with me. Ingenuity without understanding isn't ingenuity. It's luck. And luck stops working when the cold is real and the consequences are absolute. Ivar understood this too, I think. But understanding something in theory and preventing disaster in practice are 2 different things. They're separated by the gap between knowledge and experience, and that's where most accidents live. Here's who Ivar actually was. He came from somewhere in Eastern Europe, maybe Bohemia, maybe Poland. He never said explicitly, and the settlement wasn't kind enough to ask direct questions about origins they'd already decided to dismiss. But he carried in his hands the memory of a place where winter didn't just arrive as a season, it arrived as an enemy that killed. A place where knowing how to heat a space meant the difference between your children surviving and your children becoming another tragedy. He grew up with tile stoves, the kind that stand like small towers in the corner of a room, built by craftsmen who understood heat the way musicians understand sound. These stoves were works of art and engineering combined. You'd feed them once or twice a day with carefully cut wood, and they'd radiate warmth for hours, the heat stored in thousands of pounds of tile and clay, releasing slowly, evenly, keeping a space comfortable from morning through the deepest part of night. On the prairie in 1884, there were no tile stoves. There was no imported German craftsmanship. There was no infrastructure for building those kinds of structures. What there was, clay, stone, and a man's labor. What Ivar decided was that the principle didn't need the form. Heat storage didn't require tile. It required mass. Tile worked because it was massive, and it held heat. Stone would do the same. Clay would do the same. And if you buried the storage directly beneath where people lived, you could heat the space from below, radiate warmth upward through a wooden floor, create comfort the way ancient cultures had created it for thousands of years before anyone ever invented the fireplace as a central feature. The ondol system, that's what the Korean architecture uses. In Korea, families had slept on heated floors for over 2,000 years. The Romans heated bathhouses using a nearly identical principle, a hypocaust system, they called it. Hot air from furnaces moved through channels beneath marble floors and stone walls, warming everything, creating an environment where you could actually be comfortable in climates that seemed designed to kill comfort. In Afghanistan and Turkey and Persia, similar systems existed. The principle was universal. Whenever humans lived in a place where winter got serious, this idea eventually appeared. Heat from a fire moved through channels in the earth, warming the floor, heating the space above. Simple. Ancient. Proven across centuries and continents, but on the Nebraska prairie in 1884, it was new because it had been forgotten, dismissed as old world knowledge, the sort of thing that people from Europe did because they were backward and didn't have access to modern methods. Ivar started digging in April of 1884. The ground was softer then, though softer is relative when you're trying to penetrate prairie earth that's been compacted by climate and time, and the weight of winter after winter. He'd work in the morning when the temperature was bearable, rest during the heat of afternoon, work again in evening as the sun moved lower. His hands blistered in the first week. By the second week, the blisters had calloused over into layers of thickened skin. By the third week, the pain had become almost abstract, a sensation he registered but no longer fought against. His shoulder screamed. His back remembered being young, and then started to wonder if it would remember that state ever again. The channels he dug ran in serpentine patterns beneath what would become his cabin floor. They were 12 to 18 inches below ground level, spaced roughly 18 inches apart. Each channel cut approximately 1.5 feet wide. The work consumed 10 weeks of labor, 10 weeks of picking and shoveling, 10 weeks of sweat and blisters, and the slow, grinding progress of moving earth with primitive tools. He worked methodically, understanding that the layout had to be precise. The heat needed to distribute evenly across the entire floor space. If channels were too close together, the heat flow would be restricted, becoming bottlenecked in tight quarters. If they were too far apart, cold spots would emerge, areas of the floor that remained cool even as other sections radiated warmth. He spent hours with rope and stakes, measuring distances repeatedly, adjusting the pattern until it satisfied him. By late summer, the channels existed, not visible from above, buried deep in the structure of the earth, but there, running beneath the cabin in an intricate network that would carry heat through the frozen months to come. Stone selection came next. He walked creek beds and prairie surfaces, examining rocks, selecting flat pieces that would fit tightly against each other, stones that sat stable and wouldn't shift as the earth settled and seasons changed. Stone with a smooth surface that could be mortared properly. Stone with enough thermal mass to hold heat and release it slowly. He filled 2 wagons with carefully selected rock, each piece chosen after brief examination and deliberation. The work was quieter than the digging, but no less important. You could have channels of perfect geometry destroyed by poor stone selection, rock that cracked under thermal stress, stone that broke apart during the heating cycles, material that failed fundamentally when exposed to the temperature variations the system would create. He lined each channel with flat stones fitted tightly together, creating a complete surface that could channel heat without letting it escape sideways into the surrounding earth. The fitting was meticulous work. He used clay mixed with straw as mortar, a sealant that had worked for centuries in other places. The straw created tensile strength that pure clay lacked. The clay created a waterproof barrier and a thermal conductor. He understood load-bearing and thermal properties and the way different materials respond to heat and cooling cycles. Stones crack if thermal stress builds too suddenly. Mortar fails if it's not cured properly. The whole system becomes useless if any single component starts to fail. He tested everything methodically. He ran air through channels before sealing them permanently, checking that the flow moved where it should, that air resistance was minimal, that the paths were true and functional. He traced the routes with his hand, feeling for blockages, understanding the system through direct contact rather than just visual inspection. The floor slab itself demanded equal precision. He laid down the first layer, 4 inches of compacted stone and clay, tamped down with his feet and tools, creating a foundation that could support the weight of people and furniture without cracking. Above that, another layer of clay mixed with sand, this mixture more refined, more uniform. Above that, a final 4 inches of clay insulation, creating a thermal buffer that would prevent heat from dissipating too quickly upward. Above all of this, wooden planks selected carefully, fitted tightly together, creating a seamless surface with no gaps between boards. He sealed the joints with clay and straw mortar. The goal was uniformity. No hot spots where heat concentrated and created uneven temperature gradients. No cold spots where heat failed to reach. Just even, consistent warmth spreading across the entire floor, a warmth that rises upward into the space above and creates comfort. He built an external fire pit east of the cabin, below ground level slightly, surrounded by stone arranged to funnel heat upward and toward the cabin structure. The stones were positioned to create something resembling a chimney effect, heat rising, moving upward naturally, being channeled toward the large chamber he'd built beneath the eastern wall of his cabin. That chamber was the heart of the system. It was where hot air from the fire pit would collect and begin its slow journey through the channels beneath the floor. The channels ran serpentine beneath the cabin, winding back and forth, allowing the air time to transfer its heat into the stone, into the clay, into the earth itself. As the air moved eastward to westward, it cooled. As it cooled, it became heavier. On the western side of the cabin, he'd cut a small aperture, a barely noticeable opening, where the cooled air could exit back outside, completing the cycle. The temperature difference between inside the channels and outside winter air would pull that cooled air out naturally. Gravity would help. Pressure from incoming hot air would help. It would be a continuous cycle, self-sustaining, powered by the difference between fire and winter. He'd finished the construction by late October 1884. The cabin itself was small, 15 by 20 feet. One main room with a fireplace he'd built with the same precision as the channels. Stone chimney rising through the roof, solidly constructed, designed to draw smoke cleanly without backdraft. A tiny loft accessed by ladder, space for sleeping without taking up floor room below. Windows sealed with greased paper that was translucent and yellowed and let in just enough light to avoid living in total darkness. Nothing fancy. Nothing that suggested the engineering beneath. From the outside, it looked like every other homesteader's cabin. Poor, simple, desperate. The genius was hidden. The knowledge was buried. The system was invisible. Jump forward to January 1889. He'd been maintaining that fire pit constantly for months, not dramatically burning wood at a rate that would bankrupt him. Just consistent, steady heat. the kind you could sustain indefinitely, day after day, week after week, through a winter that would otherwise kill you. The cabin stayed warm. The floor reached a temperature of about 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit near the fire pit end, dropped to about 70 to 80 degrees at the far western end. Even at the cool end, it was warm enough to notice immediately, warm enough to step onto with bare feet and feel comfort instead of cold, warm enough to change your entire understanding of what winter survival could mean. Everyone who visited the cabin felt it. Joseph, his closest neighbor, felt it and understood immediately that something profound had been achieved. Nate, the settlement's carpenter, felt it and had to restructure his entire understanding of physics and heat transfer. When Nate ran his hand across the floor planks, feeling the warmth flowing upward through solid wood, his expression shifted. He looked at Ivar and said, "I don't understand what I'm feeling." Ivar smiled slightly and said, "It's heat moving upward from below. The system works." Nate said slowly, "This shouldn't work. There's no way this works. But I'm standing on it and it works." Other neighbors felt it and didn't know what to think, so they just kept coming back, looking for explanations, finding only the fact of the warmth. The settlement's records showed temperatures that January hitting 35 below zero repeatedly. The wind howled constantly, exposed skin frostbit in minutes. Cattle froze to death in fields. And Ivar's cabin was warm, not just heated, warm, fundamentally, essentially. Comfortable warm. His daughter started getting the headaches in the second week of January, 14 days after the system began operating at full intensity. The headaches began as a dull ache behind her eyes, barely noticeable, something she could ignore while doing her work. By the end of the first week of headaches, she mentioned it to her mother. By the second week, the pain was constant and impossible to dismiss. She'd wake with the ache already present as though the pain had never truly left her, had simply diminished slightly during sleep. She moved through the cabin slowly, deliberately, as though the world had become resistant to her movement. She'd been a girl full of energy before. After the headaches began, she moved like an old woman carrying unnecessary weight. His wife started mentioning dizziness around the same time. Nothing acute. Just, "I felt strange this morning," and "the room tilted when I stood up," and then she'd shake her head, like clearing water from her ears, and continue working. By the third week, she mentioned the sensation had gotten worse. Mornings were the worst. She'd stand up and the cabin would spin. She'd sit back down. After a few minutes, the spinning would stop. Ivar didn't connect these symptoms to the floor. Why would he? The floor was his triumph. The floor was working. The floor was keeping them alive. His son remained completely healthy. Ivar himself remained completely healthy. He'd leave the cabin before dawn to tend the livestock, wouldn't return until late afternoon, wasn't inside during the warmest part of the day when the poison would be accumulating most heavily. The symptoms seemed like winter sickness, the type of thing that affected people when they lived in close quarters, eating preserved food, dealing with the psychological weight of darkness and cold. But the girl's headaches were intensifying. Her movements were becoming slower. Her voice had taken on a hollowed-out quality, the voice of someone speaking through exhaustion. What he didn't know, what nobody on that prairie could have known, because carbon monoxide poisoning was still poorly understood in 1889, even in medical circles, and the symptoms were vague and easy to misattribute, was that his channeling system had developed a critical problem. Clay floors don't remain perfect forever. Clay is a living material in its way. It responds to temperature cycles, to moisture content changes, to the stress of heat moving through it repeatedly. The thermal expansion and contraction of the clay created internal stress, Where stress concentrated, hairline fractures began to form. These weren't visible to casual inspection. They were barely visible to intense inspection. Just small fissures in the clay surface, almost invisible cracks running like spider webs through the material. They appeared after about 3 weeks of the system, operating at full intensity as the thermal cycles multiplied, as the material expanded and contracted and began to wear. These hairline cracks were small, barely visible at all, just small enough to let combustion gases seep through, just small enough that the eye couldn't see them, just large enough to kill you slowly. Carbon monoxide is an odorless, colorless gas. It's produced when fire doesn't have enough oxygen, when combustion is incomplete. In a furnace that's operating constantly, feeding wood into fire repeatedly, there's always some CO being produced. In a properly sealed system with good ventilation, that gas moves out and away through the exhaust path, exits cleanly into the winter air. In a system with hairline cracks in the floor, that gas seeps upward into the space where people are breathing, accumulating slowly, building concentration hour after hour. The body doesn't recognize CO as a poison, so it doesn't trigger the gag reflex or the panic response that poisons with taste or smell trigger. There's no warning system. The gas binds to hemoglobin, preventing oxygen from bonding to it. Your blood literally can't carry oxygen to your tissues, so your cells start to suffocate, slowly, steadily, without any clear warning. The symptoms come on gradually: headache, nausea, confusion, fatigue, dizziness, a feeling of heaviness that makes movement difficult. Something you might attribute to any number of causes, the kind of thing you might not connect to the source until someone much later explains the system to you, and you suddenly understand that the thing you'd built to save them was actually the thing that was killing them by inches. By the end of the 3rd week, his wife mentioned that her dizziness had worsened significantly. She said, "I don't feel right inside this cabin. Something feels wrong with the air." Ivar told her, "It's just winter. It affects everyone this way." She said, "No, this is different. The air itself feels wrong." His daughter, by this point, had stopped complaining about the headaches. She'd moved beyond the point of complaint. She simply endured them in silence, moving through the cabin with a slowness that was becoming alarming. Ivar gave them rest. He gave them warm food. He didn't think, because why would he think, that the warm air they were breathing, pulled directly from the channels beneath the floor, filtering upward through the clay, was slowly suffocating them. Clara says this is the part that burns hardest when you're telling the story. A man who understood heat and engineering and the ancient principles of climate control well enough to rebuild a system that had kept civilizations alive for millennia. A man who'd spent months digging channels and selecting stone and testing every component. A man who believed in what he was building so completely that he was willing to face the settlement's mockery and doubt because he knew, in his bones, that it would work. And his ingenuity was killing the people he loved most in the world. The knowledge without the final understanding, the system without the crucial detail, the triumph containing the poison. The traveler arrived in late February when the worst of the cold was finally beginning to break slightly. He came on horseback from somewhere east, traveling to somewhere west. The specific details didn't matter to anyone who met him. What mattered was that he'd spent time in Korea, not as a tourist, as a student. He'd walked through homes where families slept on heated floors. He'd studied the Ondel system with the intensity of a scholar studying something precious and complex. He'd examined the seals, questioned the engineers, understood the architecture at a level that came from both book knowledge and lived experience. He'd learned Korean. He'd stayed through winters. He'd watched the systems operate and fail and succeed. When he walked into an inn and asked about anyone with knowledge of heating systems, the innkeeper had only one suggestion. There's a man named Ivar, few miles out, digging under his cabin. Everybody thinks he's mad. The moment the traveler stepped inside Ivar's cabin, the moment he felt the floor beneath his feet, his entire demeanor changed. The warmth struck him immediately. The floor was genuinely warm, actively radiating heat in a way that was impossible with conventional heating. "This is a gudul," he said immediately. Not a question, recognition. The word came from his mouth like someone had just confirmed something he'd been searching for. A moment of finding proof of something he'd already suspected. "This is... How are you sealing the floor?" His voice had shifted from amazement to something else. Concern, maybe, or alarm. Ivar showed him everything. Showed him the construction, the channels beneath the floor, the external fire pit, the way the system operated. He was proud of what he'd built. He explained each decision, the stone selection, the clay mortar, the spacing of channels, the ventilation apertures. The traveler listened and nodded and said, yes, the principle is sound. This is exactly correct." And then his entire demeanor changed. He got down on his hands and knees, his face close to the wooden planks, studying the surface with the intensity of a detective searching for evidence of a crime. His hands traced lines that Ivar couldn't see. His eyes narrowed. His mouth tightened. His entire body language shifted from appreciation to alarm. "You have cracks," the traveler said quietly. Not a question. Certainty. His finger traced an almost invisible line in the floor. Small cracks. In the floor surface, the kind that look insignificant, but they're not. They're leaking gas. Ivar felt something shift inside him. He got down on his hands and knees, too, examining the floor. He couldn't see the cracks the traveler was seeing. Not at first. But as the traveler pointed to specific locations and traced lines with his finger, Ivar began to see them. Hairline fractures, barely visible, just small enough to dismiss as natural variation in the clay. Just large enough to create a pathway for gas. "I don't see," Ivar started. The traveler said, "Look here, and here, and here. The thermal cycling is creating stress. The clay is cracking. You have multiple ruptures in your seal." What happened next was a conversation about Korea in the 1800s, about families who'd lived through cold similar to Nebraska's cold, who'd built ondol systems similar to this one, who'd maintained them through winters just as brutal and long. The traveler described families who'd gotten headaches that wouldn't go away, mothers and children who'd felt dizzy on winter mornings, young people who'd become confused and lethargic, as though a vital part of their will had been drained. The traveler said, after months or weeks, after enough exposure to the slowly building poison, people would die. The deaths would come in families that seemed healthy otherwise. The family would start with headaches. The headaches would get worse. Then confusion. Then the person would just stop. The body would stop functioning. The family would assume it was winter sickness, but it wasn't. It was the system leaking gas. He explained that the system had been perfect thousands of years before. It had kept people alive through climates that killed less protected humans. But the principle came with danger, built into its design. The danger was in the imperfection of implementation. One crack. One breach in the seal. One failure of ventilation or draft, and the system became a slow killer. The Korean engineers had learned this the hard way. They'd developed obsessive protocols for sealing. They'd created inspection routines that were performed multiple times per winter. They'd learned through bitter experience that this system only worked if every component was absolutely perfect. Not good, not adequate. Perfect. One tiny weakness, the traveler said, and you're creating a carbon monoxide chamber. You're sealing your family inside a slowly poisoning environment. He placed his hand on Ivar's shoulder and said, "Your family is sick right now, isn't it? Your daughter, maybe? Your wife?" Ivar nodded slowly, understanding, finally, what had been happening. The traveler continued, "They're being poisoned by the air they're breathing, not intentionally. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the system you built is leaking gas into the space where they sleep and live." Clara notes that this is the moment Ivar's entire sense of self inverted. A moment before, he was a man who'd solved the problem of winter. A moment after, he was a man who'd poisoned his own family. The psychological impact of that transformation is something no story fully captures. You can describe the carbon monoxide. You can explain the symptoms. You can trace the chemistry. But you can't really capture the moment when a man understands that his life's work almost killed the people he loves most. That understanding stays with you forever. It rewrites everything you thought you knew about yourself. The traveler explained what Emma had understood years before through her own near disaster with the root cellar. A sealed space with an active heat source is creating combustion products. Those products have to go somewhere. If they can't exit cleanly through the designed ventilation path, they seep upward through cracks and openings into the air where people are breathing. Carbon monoxide is invisible. It's odorless. It's lethal in low concentrations over long periods. It's the perfect hidden killer. He explained that Ivar's daughter wasn't just tired. She was being slowly suffocated by the air she was breathing. His wife wasn't just dizzy. Her body was struggling to function without enough oxygen. And Ivar, because he left the cabin early and came back late and spent most of his time outside tending animals, wasn't being exposed to lethal concentrations. He felt fine because he wasn't breathing the poison as constantly as his family was. That was February 22nd, 1889, a day Ivar would remember for the rest of his life. The day his triumph became catastrophe, the day he understood that knowledge without complete understanding is danger. That's when the real work started. Not the digging, not the initial construction, but the rebuilding, the understanding of what had gone wrong, the dismantling of his own achievement, the acceptance that everything he'd built with such care and precision was incomplete, flawed, dangerous in its incompleteness. He had to tear up the floor, had to excavate the channels again, had to inspect every stone, every seam, every joint for cracks and failures, had to rebuild the entire floor surface with obsessive attention to sealing. His family moved to a neighbor's barn while he worked. The neighbor thought he was insane. "Just get a normal stove," the neighbor said. "Forget the digging. Forget the channels. Get a stove like everyone else and heat your cabin like everyone else heats their cabin." Ivar said, "The stove doesn't work well enough. The principle of the Ondal system is sound." The neighbor said, "The principle might be sound, but your system is poisoning your family. Give up." But Ivar knew the system worked if it was sealed correctly. He knew that the Ondal principle, when implemented properly, could maintain warmth more efficiently than anything the prairie had yet achieved. He knew that the knowledge he was trying to recover and preserve was worth saving, was worth the months of labor, was worth the destruction and rebuilding. He knew. But knowing and proving are different things. Proving requires getting it right. Getting it right requires obsession about details that nobody else can see. The traveler stayed to help. For 4 weeks, he worked alongside Ivar, teaching him the obsessive protocols that Korean engineers had developed through centuries of experience. He mixed clay with fine sand and animal blood, creating a sealant that had been used in ancient times, that had proven itself across centuries and continents. The animal blood created a binding agent that pure clay lacked. It created elasticity. It created a sealant that could withstand thermal cycling without cracking. He applied the first layer and let it dry for 3 full days before applying the second. 5 layers in total, each one cured thoroughly before the next, began. The work was meticulous beyond anything he'd done in the original construction. Every seam received attention. Every potential crack point was sealed multiple times. The floor was becoming a barrier so complete that nothing should have been able to pass through it, except the intentional flow of air through the channels beneath. He rebuilt the chimney from the external fire pit, made it taller, extended the length, and redirected the angle, designing it to create stronger draft. The stronger the draft pulling air upward and out of the fire pit, the more negative pressure would exist in the channels, pulling air through rather than letting it leak out through cracks. He tested this using a method that would have made Emma nod in recognition: candle tests. He'd light the furnace and then hold a candle over every seam in the floor. If the flame pulled downward, that meant gas was leaking upward. If the flame stayed still, the seal held. If the flame flickered in any direction, he knew there was still a weakness to address. The candle test became his obsession. Test after test. Crack after crack. Seam after seam. Working methodically until every single potential breach showed the flame staying absolutely still. The traveler explained the history as they worked. He said, "In Korea, there are families who've been maintaining ondol systems for 2,000 years. They know this technology in their bones. And still, there are always failures. Still, there are always people who build systems that look perfect and then discover cracks when the winter cold is worst. The knowledge saved these families from freezing, but the knowledge also killed them if they didn't implement it completely. That's the nature of this principle. Partial understanding creates catastrophe. Complete understanding creates survival." In late March, with the floor sealed completely, with the channels ready, with the external fire pit functioning perfectly and the chimney creating strong draft, Ivar moved his family back inside. He lit the furnace carefully, deliberately. He watched the heat build slowly through the channels, monitored the temperature in the floor with a thermometer, adjusted the fire intensity to ensure even heat distribution. He felt the floor warm beneath his feet, and then he waited. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks. His daughter's headaches stopped. The cessation was gradual at first, the pain diminishing slightly each day. But by the end of the first week, she mentioned that the constant ache was gone. His wife's dizziness faded in the same gradual way. She said, the room stopped tilting. His son, who hadn't been sick, stayed healthy. The symptoms that had built slowly while the system was leaking poison reversed slowly once the system was sealed. It took weeks for the body to flush the carbon monoxide from their bloodstreams, weeks for the oxygen-carrying capacity of their blood to return to normal. But it worked. The system worked. The knowledge was preserved. The principle was maintained. And his family was alive. Clara reminds me that this is the moment nobody talks about in the history books. Not the vindication, not the triumph, not the warm cabin. The moment when a man understands he almost destroyed everything he was trying to save. The moment when the thing you built to protect them nearly killed them instead. And the realization that you have to keep going anyway. That you have to rebuild. That you have to trust the knowledge again even though it broke you. That takes a different kind of strength than the original building. Emma understood that. She spent the rest of her life checking her ventilation. Ivar would spend the rest of his maintaining the seals on a system that had almost taken his family. That's the real story nobody wants to tell, not triumph over nature, survival after nearly destroying what you love. The traveler stayed for a month after they'd moved back in, helping Ivar understand the deeper principles of the ondol system, working through the maintenance routines that would prevent future problems, explaining What would be necessary to prevent future catastrophes? He taught Ivar about inspection protocols. He showed him how to identify early signs of cracking. He explained the importance of sealing the first time, but also of being willing to reseal if anything seemed wrong. When he left, heading back east or continuing west, nobody quite knew. The traveler gave Ivar a single piece of advice. This knowledge will become important to your community. People will want to learn. When they do, teach them the danger first. Teach them why the sealing matters. Teach them that a crack they can't see can kill them. That's the knowledge worth sharing more than anything else. Not how to build the system, how to make it safe. Ivar nodded and said, "I'll remember." The traveler said, "People won't listen until they have to, but eventually they will listen." He left behind a man who'd been fundamentally changed by the experience. Ivar now understood that knowledge without care and implementation was worthless, that careful engineering could be undermined by a single small flaw, that maintaining a system meant constant vigilance, that the ancient knowledge he carried could only survive if it was executed with absolute precision. Other families wanted to build systems after they'd heard about Ivar's success. Margaret, who'd been struggling with the cold, who'd nearly given up hope of survival, came to Ivar in March, asking for help. He didn't hesitate, though he was exhausted from the rebuilding, worn down by months of labor, and the knowledge of how close he'd come to tragedy. He spent 3 afternoons with Margaret, showing her how to select and fit stone, how to calculate the depth and width necessary for her floor, how to plan the external fire pit location. He taught her the candle test. He made her practice it repeatedly until she understood the principle completely. "You have to know," he told her, "that you can't see the problem with your eyes. You have to test constantly. The candle test is how you verify the seal is holding. If you skip this, your family gets sick." Margaret said, "I understand." And he said, "I need you to do more than understand. I need you to promise me you'll test every seam before you consider it finished." She said, "I promise." By July, Margaret had her channels dug. By September, they were functional and sealed properly, verified through weeks of candle tests. By January of the following year, her cabin was warm. Her children weren't huddled against a single fireplace anymore. Her hands, cracked and bleeding from endless wood splitting to keep an inadequate stove burning, began to heal. She could stop spending 12 hours each day maintaining a fire that barely kept the cabin above freezing. The system worked. She wrote Ivar a letter that said, "You saved my children's lives. I won't forget that." A man named Peterson tried to build a system and failed because he didn't understand the critical importance of sealing. He spent 3 days on floor construction and moved in without testing. His floor cracked in the same way Ivar's had, exactly the same pattern. His family got sick the same way Ivar's family had. He blamed Ivar. He came to Ivar's door in March and said, "Your system doesn't work. My family is sick. You told me this would solve the problem, and instead you poisoned my family." Ivar said, "Did you do the sealing protocol?" Peterson said, "I sealed it. I used clay. It should work." Ivar said, "Did you test it with candles?" Peterson said, "No, it looked fine." Ivar said, "There are cracks you can't see. You need to break up the floor and reseal it." Peterson said, "I'm not breaking up my entire floor because you didn't explain properly." That wasn't fair. That was the unfairness of hindsight and suffering combined, making someone else responsible for problems that came from insufficient attention to detail. Clara hates this part of the story because it's still happening. A man builds something that works and somehow becomes responsible for everyone who fails to follow instructions. His exhaustion doesn't matter. His near death of family doesn't matter. The fact that he's trying to save them doesn't matter. What matters is that Peterson didn't want to do the work, didn't want to acknowledge his own negligence. and found someone else to blame. And history, more than a century later, still records Ivar's name in county documents as missing. His achievement attributed to nobody in particular. But Peterson's failure got remembered. Peterson's suffering got remembered, and the man who tried to help him became, in some minds, the villain. That's the pattern Clara can't forgive. But it meant that not everyone who tried the system succeeded. Success required obsession. Success required understanding why each step mattered. Success required the willingness to rebuild if something wasn't right. Over the next few years, only about 2 or 3 families out of 8 who attempted to build an Ondol system actually got it working correctly. The others ran into problems with sealing, problems with draft, problems with heat distribution, problems they couldn't diagnose or solve. Some gave up after initial failure. Some blamed Ivar for promoting a system that didn't work. Some eventually figured out the problems through trial and error and reached out to Ivar for guidance. Some resisted the testing protocols and built systems that worked partially, but not completely. The knowledge was spreading, but the knowledge without the complete understanding was creating failures that made people suspicious of the entire system. He spent the next 15 springs helping people rebuild failing systems, testing seals with candles, reinforcing chimneys, redesigning fire pits, teaching people that this wasn't something you built once and then forgot about. It was something you had to understand completely, had to maintain constantly, had to monitor for signs of failure. The knowledge began to spread through the territory, adapting as it went, evolving as people added their own innovations. A woman named Sarah experimented with plants near the fire pit, creating an attached greenhouse space that used the excess heat to grow vegetables through winter. Peterson, after his initial failure and blame shifting, came back and asked for help. He built a successful second system, this time understanding the critical importance of sealing and testing. Others improved the design with their own innovations. The Ondol system became something that belonged to the community now, rather than to Ivar alone. It was no longer his invention. It was their collective survival strategy. Clara wants me to say this clearly. The county agricultural reports from 1895 mentioned the heating innovation, but they called it European heating principles, without naming Ivar. They acknowledged that some settler had figured out a system using heat from underground channels. They did not acknowledge that the settler was an Eastern European immigrant who'd recovered knowledge that his family had carried for generations. Later, historical documents would credit it to frontier ingenuity, while forgetting that the frontier had borrowed entirely from an immigrant who'd reached back through generations to recover knowledge his family had always possessed. Eventually, the system became so standard that people forgot where it had come from. They forgot that it had required an immigrant with an accent explaining something conventional. Wisdom insisted wasn't possible. They forgot that it had nearly killed a family before the danger was recognized. They forgot the months of labor, the broken pride, the having to admit that even careful engineering could miss critical flaws. They just knew that if you wanted to heat a cabin efficiently through a prairie winter, you dug channels beneath the floor and fed a constant fire into an external pit. That was how things were done. That was the obvious solution. That was the sort of thing that seemed like it had always been known. This is the part that burns. This is the anger that doesn't fade. When a system becomes normal enough that people forget it was ever controversial. When a life-saving innovation becomes so standard that its origin becomes invisible. When an immigrant's knowledge becomes frontier ingenuity, and a name becomes erasure. And that's the part that Clara holds hardest when she tells this story. Not the vindication. Not the fact that Ivar was right. Not the traveling scholar confirming ancient principles. Not even the irony that knowledge thousands of years old had to be rediscovered by someone in the 1880s and then validated by someone who'd traveled to the place where it had originated. The part that burns is this: the knowledge was there all along. The system worked. The principle was proven. The floor was warm in January while other cabins froze. That should have been enough. That should have been sufficient for people to listen, to learn, to stop dismissing someone just because he had an accent and methods that didn't match their expectations. But it wasn't. What changed wasn't the facts. What changed was whether certain people were willing to trust those facts, and that willingness didn't come from the evidence in front of them. It came from an authority figure confirming that the evidence was legitimate. It came from a man with credentials, a man who'd traveled to distant places, a man whose cultural status allowed him to validate what an immigrant had already achieved. That's the unfairness that Emma understood, and that Clara carries into this telling. The cold anger that doesn't diminish. Ivar didn't become famous. He didn't write books or give lectures. His name never appeared in the county records as the originator of the system. They wrote, "Heating Innovation, Origins Unknown," and filed it away. He lived out his life on the prairie, tending his fire pit through countless winters, maintaining his channels, keeping his cabin warm. He had a family eventually, children, a life that mattered on its local scale and nowhere else. He died without having the recognition that some part of him might have craved, though there's no evidence in any record that he craved it at all. He might have been satisfied with the simple fact that his knowledge had survived him, that his system kept people alive, that the ancient principles his family had carried through generations had taken root in a new place. He might have understood that the work itself was the only reward that mattered. Or he might have sat in his warm cabin on cold January nights and thought about how he'd had to prove himself a dozen times over before people believed him. How a traveling stranger had validated in an afternoon what he'd demonstrated over months. How credit and recognition had gone everywhere, except where they belonged. We don't know. The record doesn't tell us his inner thoughts. It only tells us that the floor was warm, the system worked, and knowledge that should have been celebrated was eventually just absorbed into common practice, so completely that its origin became invisible. The danger was real, though. The poison was invisible, but it was real. His family had lived through carbon monoxide poisoning slowly enough that survival was possible, but exposure-related sickness that went unrecognized for weeks leaves marks on the body, on the mind. It teaches you that understanding something partially is more dangerous than not understanding it at all. Emma had learned that. Ivar learned it through his daughter's headaches and his wife's dizziness. Knowledge without comprehension kills just as surely as ignorance does. Maybe kills more completely because it comes wrapped in confidence. You believe in what you've built. You believe in your understanding. And you're blindsided when the belief collides with reality and something fundamental breaks. But the system survived. The Ondal heated the frontier through countless winters, families who would have been scattered, broken, lost to the cold. They survived. Mothers who would have spent their lives in terror of winter, knowing their children might not make it through, suddenly had a resource, a way to survive, a way to keep their families warm. The principle proved itself strong enough to outlive its originator, its name, its history. It became just the way things were done. That's actually the most beautiful outcome for knowledge. Not fame, not credit, but integration. Becoming so normal that people forget it was ever controversial. Becoming so useful that its origin story becomes irrelevant. Becoming so right that nobody questions it anymore. The irony is that usefulness is its own kind of forgetting. Clara wants you to understand something specific about this. The story isn't a celebration of Ivar's triumph, though he achieved something remarkable. It's not a condemnation of the settlement's initial skepticism, though they were wrong. It's not even primarily about the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning, though that danger is real and was nearly fatal. The story is about how knowledge exists separately from its origin, how truth is true regardless of who speaks it, and how the systems of credibility in any human community are often completely disconnected from actual understanding. It's about the fundamental unfairness that appears whenever knowledge belongs to someone the powerful have already decided to dismiss. Ivar understood heat. He understood stone. He understood the principles that had kept his ancestors alive through winters that would have killed most of the people in that settlement. He understood engineering at a level that came from generations of family knowledge and practical experimentation. That understanding was visible every single day when his floor was warm and other cabins were cold. The knowledge was demonstrable. It was working. It was inarguable. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter until someone with the right credentials, the right background, the right cultural status came along and said, "This is based on principles that are ancient and respected and scientifically sound." That validation changed nothing about the actual knowledge. It only changed how people with power over community perception were willing to regard it. The traveler validated nothing that wasn't already true. He simply had the authority to make his validation matter to people who'd already decided to doubt. This is the pattern Emma spent her life running up against. This is what burned in her when she talked about people dismissing her expertise while trusting conventional wisdom that was demonstrably wrong. She'd saved her family's life through knowledge they wouldn't listen to. She'd proven repeatedly that she understood systems they didn't, and she'd watched them trust a male surveyor with credentials over her documented experience. This is what remains true on the frontier and remains true now. Knowledge belonging to certain people is accepted on faith. Knowledge belonging to other people has to be proven 100 times over before anyone will pay attention. And once it is proven, the proving often gets credited to someone else. The labor belongs to you. The credit belongs to whoever validates you. That's the economy of recognition in communities built on power, structures, and hierarchy. It's a system so complete and so invisible that it survives even when confronted with direct evidence of its unfairness. But Ivar planted a seed. He reached back into his family's knowledge, recovered something precious, implemented it in a place that didn't know it needed it. He survived the skepticism. He endured the mockery. He got sick watching his family suffer while his system was broken. He fixed it with obsessive attention to detail. He taught others. He spread knowledge. And even though his name was eventually forgotten, even though the credit went diffuse and undefined, and eventually to frontier ingenuity or practical wisdom, or the way people discovered how to do things, the knowledge survived. It helped people live. It's helped people live for over a century now. That's something. That's almost everything. The floor was warm in January. Nobody understood why. And then someone who'd studied the systems of other cultures explained it. And suddenly it made sense to people who'd been dismissing it. And then other people understood it too. And then it became normal. And then it became invisible. And then it just became the way things were done. No one questioned it. No one asked where it came from. It was simply knowledge, available to everyone equally, or so it seemed. The immigrant with the accent had disappeared into the landscape of the prairie, his name filed away in documents marked "Origins Unknown." His face faded from memory. His accent became irrelevant because the knowledge was no longer connected to him. The system existed independently, and somehow that independence made the knowledge clean, acceptable, forgettable. That's how knowledge survives. Not through fame, not through credit, but through being absolutely, undeniably useful to people who need it to stay alive. The knowledge endures because it works. It endures because people spread it, teach it, improve it, and pass it forward. It endures because eventually enough people understand it that no single person can be credited with or blamed for it. The origin story becomes irrelevant because the system becomes part of the landscape, part of the way survival works, part of the accepted solutions to problems that have no alternative. And in that transformation, from remarkable to ordinary, from debated to obvious, the person who recovered that knowledge from centuries of forgetting becomes himself forgotten. That's the trade. That's the cost. That's the reason Clara's voice carries such cold anger when she tells this story. Because the knowledge survived, yes. The system worked, yes. Families lived, yes. But the man who reached back through generations to recover it, who rebuilt it when it nearly killed his family, who taught others to maintain it with obsessive care, he became a footnote, a name filed away as unknown, filed. A story that might be told but whose main character's name vanishes into the landscape.